vaults and storage areas and so on. He said, that floor vault is just full of graphite. I said, full of graphite. How much graphite? He said, well, I reckon about 50 tons. Now that's a lot of graphite, 50 tons. I said, where'd it come from? He said, best we can tell, CP1. I said, wait a minute, you mean I've got custody of all the CP1 graphite? That, by the way, is how I ended up with that brick. Yeah. He said, yeah. I said, well, what kind of shape is it in? He said, oh, it's lightly contaminated, but we can clearly dispose of it as low-level waste. There's a place to do that. It won't cost us a lot. It won't be free. We got to dig it out of that vault and package it up and send it off. What do you want to do? I said, well, what are my options? He said, well, one, remove it and package it as low-level waste. Now, by that time, I'd been to the lab for almost 30 years. Real student of history. I loved argon. I still do. And because of argon's relationship to the Fermi project, CP1, the University of Chicago, we tended to think of all that in the same soup. So my roots, in a way, went back to CP1. Now I'm the daddy of 50 tons of CP1 graphite. And my options are dig it out of there and ship it off as low-level waste. Or, I said, I don't like that option so much, John. What's my other option? He said, put the hatch cover back on the floor and forget about it. Pretend we even discovered it was there. Pretend we didn't discover it was there. I said, I like option 2. I'll be darned if I'm going to be the argon executive that orders up getting rid of CP1 graphite. I mean, Fermi's going to roll over in his grave. So will Zen. No way. I mean, when I get to nuclear engineering heaven, let's assume I make that stage, I can just see Fermi and Zen sitting there saying, and tell us, Dr. Lineberry, by what stretch of the imagination was it a good idea for you to dispose as low-level waste of all of that precious graphite? So I didn't have to face that happy story. Instead, we cut it up in bricks like that. But when you got 50 tons, you got a lot of bricks. I don't know where the others are. I don't want any more than that. All right. Look, nuclear is not without its challenges, and that's a good thing. Back to issues today. Help me out. We could expand on any of these issues and make more of them. We could make sub-issues to, if we agreed these were the main issues. These run the whole waterfront. And it's Lineberry's list that it was kind of like watching You've Got Mail. That is, I went back to my computer 2 or 3 times and added another issue to the list, and I could clearly add more, and you could add more. What are the issues associated with nuclear power? Either technical issues, public issues, political issues, I don't care. Cost, we got to make nuclear reactors affordable. We don't know what they cost today because the last one we completed in the United States was decades ago, and we've got a new licensing regime today. So we need to find out what the cost of these things are. And cost estimates are just that, estimates. You need an arm's length transaction where utility generator A buys a reactor from vendor C. You put that project together, the reactor gets licensed, you start producing power. That's the cost, not the cost estimate. Issues in nuclear power today, protection against nuclear accidents. The industry's done a marvelous job. In the United States, since 3 Mile Island, operating nuclear reactors. Capacity factors are oftentimes 100%. They'll run for a year and a half without ever shutting down, and finally shut down for refueling and maintenance. I believe it was a South Texas project, just went its 5th cycle, what they call breaker-to-breaker run, where they now started up 5 times in a row, the same reactor, run for a year and a half, and never have to shut down in between. So 7.5 years of continuous operation, except for about a 25-day outage for refueling and maintenance. We got to protect against accidents. Another serious accident, actually it doesn't have to be in the United States. If it's a Western style reactor, unlike Chernobyl, but if it's If it's a reactor design we would recognize and we have an accident, I don't care where it is, it'll affect nuclear energy in the United States. And it's not just reactor accidents either. Accidental criticalities in fuel cycle facilities and so on, all of those things could, in fact, take away the momentum for a nuclear renaissance. Great deal of emphasis today, concern about proliferation, even nuclear terrorism, but I consider the first thing, proliferation, to be the larger, more credible threat. Certainly there's an issue about public perception about nuclear. There has been that for many, many years. It's still extant today, although that seems to be somewhat on the mend in recent years. Concerns about issues about nuclear waste. Where do we put high-level waste? There isn't much of it. That's the good news. The bad news is it looks like we're canceling Yucca Mountain. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. It was going to cost $70 billion. We've spent $10 billion already. That seems like a lot for a hole in the ground. We got to put high-level waste somewhere. Sustainability. We'll run out of uranium eventually if we use light water reactors, and yet light water reactors are the reactor today, and the nuclear renaissance depends on continuing to build and deploy light water reactors. They use an awful lot of uranium. Only about 7/10 of the uranium you dig up is useful in the reactor. That's the U-235. So eventually we'll run out of uranium. We got to go to advanced reactors, so-called breeder reactors, fast reactors. They're actually pretty slow. They stay in one place, but the neutrons are highly energetic. They don't come into thermal equilibrium, so we call them fast reactors just to confuse everybody. Issues with nuclear energy or environmental impact, nuclear compared to alternatives. I think that's a good story, not a bad story. Technical issues, what if the future reactors look like if they're not light water reactors? What do they give way to, on what time scale? Those new reactors have to be affordable. They certainly have to be safe. They have to satisfy all the other issues. Finally, if you get away from light water reactors and find a way to use the U-238, you've got to recycle the fuel. You've got to reprocess. That's a political issue, but it's also a technical issue. What technology? The one discovered in the Manhattan Project was dissolve nuclear fuel in nitric acid, put it in a dilute solution, and then by valence changes you separate the stuff you want from the stuff you don't want. Eventually end up with very high purity plutonium or high purity uranium. There's an alternative, in one of the two centers of the development of this technology, pyroprocess, is out here at the INL. At the FCF fuel conditioning facility, but what do we call what used to be Argonne West? Materials and Fuels Complex, MFC. I can't keep up with all the acronyms. No, I don't know. Anybody got other issues they want to add to this, or sub-issues, or comment on any of these? We're down to 7 minutes, so make the comments fast if you have any. Gonzaga, you got any other issues? You're the hondo of this nuclear engineering soiree.
Actually, if nobody will speak up, I've got a question for you.
I didn't plant this.
I've often wondered why people haven't seriously pursued the thorium cycle. It's my understanding that it's possible to achieve breeding ratios of greater than 1 at thermal energies.
Yeah, you can't do anything with thorium that you can't do with uranium and plutonium. But there are two kinds of fuel cycles. There's a uranium plutonium fuel cycle. There's also the thorium to U-233 fuel cycle. It's not true that everybody has walked away from the thorium fuel cycle. The Indians have not. And the interesting fact is that within India, there's a fairly large amount of thorium reserves, and there's almost no uranium. Don't ask me why. And so the Indians are naturally interested in thorium as an alternative to natural uranium, and you breed U-233. U-233 is as good a fuel as U-235 is, or plutonium-239. So you can do that. Fuel cycle's a little more difficult. Thorium's hard to get to dissolve. It hasn't seriously been worked pretty much anywhere outside India, though, Todd. You're right. But you can, in fact, develop that as a way of enhancing your crustal resources that you can use for nuclear energy. Good point. Other issues or sub-issues? Well,
Maybe just a comment on the plutonium versus the U-233 cycle. We have a legacy in the United States, 750,000 tons of depleted uranium. That plus our used nuclear fuel could provide all our electricity for 1,000 years. We would hardly need any enrichment plants, probably one for the whole world, but we're just talking about the United States, we'd get by with one. And with that legacy, it sort of says, hey, USA, why do we need to pursue thorium? Because we can take care of ourselves for the next 1,000 years with what we have sitting around being unused and being guarded right now as nuclear waste.
Yeah. Well, you're no student. I recognize that voice. Thank you, Dr. Coons. Very good point. There is an awful lot of depleted uranium that has come from U.S. enrichment plants. And you run uranium through an enrichment plant, and maybe 10% of it is what comes out the product end as enriched uranium. 90% of it ends up as depleted uranium in a big pile over here. And Dr. Coons is exactly right. What do you do with that pile? Right now, we store it. We monitor it. We provide surveillance. Do we have a use for it? Yeah, if we develop fast reactors, sodium-cooled reactors, use for it. If we don't, it's a waste. Right now, we tend to think of it more as a scrap than a waste. We'll use it eventually. But once you declare it waste, that's a bad thing in the United States, because then it gets managed as a waste and comes under the full force of the waste management legislation. 3 minutes. Anything else? Okay. Thank you very much.
I had one question. What's the biggest thing stopping us from using those fast reactors and using all that waste as fuel?
Well, okay. Lineberry's belief. Fast reactors are still a developmental proposition. There's still research and development needed. It's not ready for prime time. In my view, we ought to get along with that research, move it ahead, which probably means building a government demonstration facility. Technically, I think we're prepared to do that. We've come plenty far enough to do that. Politically, the will is not there at the moment to do it. It's going to cost several $1 billion. I mean, we used to think of that as real money before the stimulus package and $1.4 trillion deficits. Maybe now we should propose that again, Todd, Jay. Money doesn't seem to mean anything anymore. It will, by the way. So the biggest impediment is probably the political will to keep the fast reactor program moving ahead. But it's not like we're ready to commercialize that. GE people would disagree with me, I will say. There are people in the industry that would disagree with me, but they're wrong. That's another beautiful thing about being a professor. You can always think you're right. Yeah, and students don't argue with you until they're graduate students. Then the arguments start to come. All right, I enjoyed visiting with you. I hope to see you as you move on through your engineering career. I congratulate you, as I did before, in choosing engineering as the field to pursue. I think you'll have a very fine career regardless of the discipline. So, peace.
Well, I think that concludes our nuclear coverage for the semester. I believe the civils take over next. Hopefully we've given you a flavor of everybody on our faculty, so you've had a chance to meet them all. We're quite a bunch of characters, so hopefully we'll see some of you in future classes.